Welcome back, guys. Today we are going to begin Unit 8, which is about ecology. Now, ecology for me tends to be the easiest unit, and it focuses around three kind of levels. It focuses around ecosystems, communities, and populations. And what we'll do is we'll start with the biggest level, and then we'll work to communities, and then finish up with population and population dynamics. All right. So today we are going to be looking at something we call ecosystem structure. Ecosystem structure. So the first thing we'll do is kind of find ecosystems within the hierarchy of this level of organization. All right, so here you can see these levels of organization. And again, we're focusing on the top half of this. So biosphere is the highest level of organization, right? It contains the earth, and all the various biomes and ecosystems on the planet. So today we're going to focus on ecosystem, which will be the community and the non-living surroundings. And we'll continue to come back to this when we look at communities and populations. So again, there's three levels here, really: ecosystem, community, and population. We'll spend a day or a session on each. So let's just go ahead and define what an ecosystem is. And we'll define it as all the communities and these abiotic, which are non-living factors in an area. So biotic factors would be living factors, living organisms, plants, animals. Non-living factors would be like water resources, would be like the topography, would be the geology. So an ecosystem takes into account all of those things, right? And when we look at all the ecosystems in a particular area, what we get is a biome. So we'll go ahead and we'll describe kind of a biome here, and we'll call this all the ecosystems in a large area with a certain precipitation value, so rain or snow, and then typically there's going to be a set temperature range. So those two things are really going to dictate kind of what biome is established. All right, so when we look at kind of biomes, they're going to be dictated by a couple of factors here. So let's go and get a look at that. So your biomes are going to be set essentially by the distribution of sunlight and how direct that incoming solar radiation is. So here we see at the equator, we have a much more direct angle of solar radiation coming and striking the planet. As you move towards the poles in the middle latitudes, that solar radiation is concentrated over a larger area, and so the directness is less of a direct hit, and you get less concentrated solar energy there. And you can see the intensity of the solar interaction here. This is going to be much more intense, and this is less intense. That means we're getting more solar radiation at the equator and less towards the poles. So that affects your temperature range. Also, the distribution of water is also going to affect temperature range and going to affect precipitation values and how much rain and snowfall you get. So what we'll say here is that latitude drives the amount of solar energy that an ecosystem or biome receives. And we could sketch this out, and we'll go ahead and just do that here. So if we sketch Earth here, we said that, again, if this is Earth's axis, right? So there's Earth's axis, so it's got a tilt to it, right? And normally, if it was straight through the poles, right, the poles are right here. So there's a difference here of about 23.5 degrees, 23.5 angular degrees. So that tilt also impacts things as well. And we said that, again, at the equator, right, we have a really direct angle of incoming solar radiation, so we're getting more. And then at the poles, that solar radiation covers more distance, and it's, again, less direct. So latitude has a big impact on your annual temperature range. Precipitation is a little bit more complex. It has to do with, where oceans are distributed. It has to do with topographic features like mountain ranges, if you're on the windward side or the leeward side. It also has to do with global wind belts. So here we have the rising air that's heated at the equator. We know as air is heated, it becomes less dense and it wants to rise. So here at the equator, we have this heated air that's going to want to rise and come out of the screen towards you or up away from Earth. It's then going to move towards the middle latitudes, and it's going to get to the middle latitudes here and start to sink. And that happens on both sides of the equator. So the orange and the blue here aren't for warm and cold. They're just on other sides of the equator. So we have this warming air that's going away from the planet here at the equator, and then it's sinking back down at the middle latitudes, and that's happening on both sides. And then we also have cool air that's sinking at the poles and then moving towards the middle latitudes and then rising back up. These are called Hadley cells. Um, these between the equator and the middle latitudes, 30 degrees um, latitude north or south of the equator. Then we have some middle latitude cells that are between 30 and 60, and that is where the air is going to sink at the polar 60 degree and then move towards the equator. So we have this very dynamic system that's moving air around, and this will impact, where your weather comes from. It'll impact whether or not you receive a lot of moisture, because it'll impact if air is coming off the ocean or if it's coming over land before it gets to you. This, along with Coriolis effect, the spin of the Earth, creates the global wind belts, the southeasterly trades or the westerly winds. So all these things have a direct impact on what biome we're going to see. So we take all of those factors into account. Here's the setup for all the biomes that exist on the planet. And you can see that this is quite a colorful figure. There's a lot of information here. And, towards the equator, where we have warmer temperatures, we have certain biomes, where we have certain moisture and precipitation values, we have certain biomes. So there's a lot to take in and a lot to try to sort out. So what we'll do is we'll just try to plot some of the simple biomes on an XY coordinate plane looking at precipitation and temperature ranges. So we're going to do that now. So here we are looking at, again, a plot that we're going to make of temperature and precip, and we're going to be able to slot in most of these biomes on just a simple graph rather than having that big, complicated globe. What we'll do is we'll just look at the two factors that really dictate these things and then try to slot these in appropriate. So over here, we're going to have precipitation, and we're going to have values from 0, 100. We'll make this centimeters of rainfall annually or snowfall. It could be. So 200, 300, and we'll max this out at about 400. And then on the x-axis, so that's the y-axis, on the x-axis, we'll have temperature in degrees Celsius, and we'll go from like -10, extremely cold, to 0, to 10, to 20. And the room you're sitting in is probably around 21 degrees or so, and then 30. So what we'll do here is if we go back, we'll kind of toggle back and forth between these two. If we evaluate where it's very cold and very little precipitation, that's going to put us probably somewhere up here. Now, we're not going to go ahead and graph the Arctic, but we'll look at, up in this dark kind of forest green color here, we've got, really cold temperatures because we're away from the equator and not a whole lot of moisture that is produced. So it's not this, we'll go even above the forest green. It's kind of this sea foam color green here. It's not this Arctic Greenland area, but it's this kind of lighter teal color. That's going to be what we call our tundra. So we'll go ahead and slot that in, and we'll slot it in right here. So the tundra is going to be where we have really cold temperatures and not a whole lot of moisture available, right? And then what we'll do is we'll work a little bit warmer and with a little bit more moisture. And what we'll see is when we do that, right, a little bit more moisture, a little bit closer to the equator, we get this darker green, this forest green color, and that's what we call the taiga, right? We can catalog it over here on the side. So we'll go ahead and put that one down. So taiga should be around right here. A little warmer, a little bit more moisture. And then if we take that taiga area, keep the moisture the same, right? And that's going to be defined by big coniferous trees, large conifer forests. We warm it up just a bit. What we're going to see will be, we'll subtract just a little bit of moisture. So maybe split the moisture between the tundra and the taiga. So not enough moisture for trees to grow, but warmer temperatures. What we should see annually will be a grassland. So we're going to go ahead and make that mark like right here that we'll have a grassland, or like the prairies. So you think about Nebraska, think about Oklahoma, northern Texas, Kansas, that'll fall right in this region here. If we add a bit more moisture to that, where trees can now grow, we'll have a temperate forest. So go ahead and put a temperate forest here. So we'll toggle back to the map and find these two regions. So again, grassland is going to be this temperate steppe here in yellow. The temperate forest is going to be this lighter green area. So again, the amount of moisture here and is really what's dictating this. The temperature is by and large the same, but it's the moisture content that's dictating this more than anything else. If we go with more moisture here, we're going to get kind of a temperate rainforest. So not like a tropical rainforest. So if we find like something like this montane forest is what they're calling it here. Or even this subtropical forest we'd be working with that where we're getting, again, decent amount of temperature and a lot of rain. So we'll go ahead and make that mark. Go ahead and slot that one in up here. We'll say temperate. So this is like a temperate subtropical rainforest. It's not a tropical rainforest, but subtropical. We could then easily slide to the right, add some more temperature to this, keep the moisture level really high, and then we're going to have our true tropical rainforest. Right, if we start removing some moisture from this, we keep the temperature really high, we're going to have our dry forest where the leaves are seasonal. They're going to fall during the dry season. Again, we pull more precip out of this, keep it pretty warm. We're going to have our kind of savanna type area. And then we pull all the moisture out and we get a desert. So those are our basic biomes kind of set up on a coordinate plane of temperature and precip. And again, we can identify those on here. So, we started with the tropical rainforest, so we're going to look along the equator here. It's going to be this dark green area. So here's the equator, here's our tropical rainforest and these dark green areas. Our dry forest would be the kind of this more olive color here. So our dry forest not getting as much moisture. Our savanna is going to be this color here, kind of the yellowish ochre color, the grass savanna, or even the tree savanna, both of them play. And then the desert, of course, according to our information here, is going to be this, right in this belt here, this arid desert and this semi-arid desert. So what we'll do is we can kind of move past that and we'll talk about some cycling that occurs here. So we're going to slide that out of the way. And we'll say we're going to look at how matter. So we're going to look at how matter and energy are conserved in ecosystems. So matter and energy, they are conserved in ecosystems. And specifically, energy is going to be transferred and matter is going to be cycled. And we'll get to things called limiting factors. We'll go ahead and kind of slot those ideas in here now. There's this idea of a limiting factor, and when we talk about populations and communities, these will also come up. But a limiting factor is going to be a thing or an item, a factor that controls the distribution and abundance of organisms. Now, this maybe fits better in populations, but we'll just kind of throw it in here now, and then we'll bring it back up when we talk about populations. Because we're going to have density-dependent limiting factors and density-independent limiting factors. So we'll bring that back around when we talk about populations. But here, what we want to do is just a quick look at some of these cycles or matter cycling events. So these are commonly known as the biogeochemical cycles, the biogeochemical cycles. And we have 4 of these that we're going to focus on. And really, you've done a lot of work with these in the past, so we don't need to spend a significant amount of time here. The first one is the water cycle. So we'll go ahead and pull that up. Right, so here's the water cycle, and we understand that as water reservoirs like the ocean, large water reservoirs are heated up, water is going to vaporize and evaporate. It's then going to condense on condensation nuclei, form clouds. As it rises, water or air loses its capacity to hold water, so it's going to condense and it's going to fall as rain. And again, different topographic features, like mountains, as mountains force air to rise, water is going to be released on one side, and then the backside is going to be quite dry. That water is going to then run off into rivers, creeks, streams, run back into the ocean eventually. It's going to infiltrate into the ground, be absorbed by plants and be released back to the atmosphere via transpiration. So that's all the water cycle, and I don't think we need to spend a whole lot more time in that space. So then what we want to do is we'll transition to the second cycle that we call the carbon cycle. And specifically, what we want to focus on with the carbon cycle is the relationship of cell respiration and photosynthesis. Right, so when we look at this, we'll go ahead and kind of go back to our map here. So when we look at this, we've got plants taking in carbon dioxide, right, releasing oxygen, and then animals taking in oxygen gas and releasing carbon dioxide. So that's the part with biology that we're really focused on. Again, we see trees over here, broadleaf trees doing this much more extensively than these conifers. We have fossil fuels, right, and cement production that are putting a lot of gigatons of carbon per year. We see that here. The ocean is a massive source of carbon uptake and bringing carbon back in. So we kind of see this carbon budget. So again, what we'll do is we'll just make some simple marks here. So again, cell respiration from animals is putting CO2 into the air. And then photosynthesis is pulling CO2 from the air. Right, and we want to keep that in mind in terms of that relationship. Third cycle is what we call the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen cycle, and this one is going to be kind of more unfamiliar to you. Now, why do we need nitrogen? All proteins have an amino group that has nitrogen, and also all your nucleotides have a nitrogenous base that contains nitrogen. So these things have nitrogen. So we do have a nitrogen requirement because we have so many materials that have nitrogen. But atmospheric gas that is mostly nitrogen is not usable to us, right? That the nitrogen gas in the air, it's too stable for the enzymes that we have at our disposal in our cells to break that atmospheric gas apart. So we can't use the nitrogen that's in the air. So we rely on bacteria to do this through a process called nitrogen fixation. So go ahead and make a mark of that. So nitrogen fixation, we'll look at this on the figure here in just a minute. So in nitrogen fixation, bacteria take the atmospheric nitrogen which is N2, two atoms of nitrogen bonded together, and they combine this with hydrogen and oxygen to make ammonia, then to make nitrate or nitrite. And those are things that plants can then use and absorb into their roots and assimilate into their tissues. And then we eat those plants, or herbivores eat those plants, and we eat those herbivores, and then we get our nitrogen in that fashion. So certain plants do this better than others. And certain plants have a symbiotic relationship with certain types of bacteria, like Rhizobium, that do this, and those plants are called legumes. So leguminous plants are like bean plants, so soybeans or pea plants. And they have a nice relationship with bacteria where they can provide nitrogen into the soil for the plant in return for that living on the roots of those plants. So this is where the idea of crop rotation comes into play. You plant something that returns nitrogen to the soil, like soybeans, so the next year you can plant something like corn that uses lots of nitrogen. We'll look at this here in just a second. So here's this nitrogen cycle, and we can see that, again, we have all this nitrogen gas, 78% of the atmosphere. We can't use it, so we rely on bacteria to fix it and combine it with hydrogen and then oxygen, two different types of bacteria. One is going to provide the hydrogen to make ammonia. The second one will provide the oxygen to make it nitrite or nitrate. And then that is when plants can actually bring it up and use it. Then it gets put into the food chain and food web for plants and animals to make use of. There's other bacteria that can then take that nitrite or nitrate and denitrify it and return it to the atmosphere. So that's the cycle. One thing we kind of sped through when we were talking about carbon dioxide and carbon cycle, again, as fossil fuels release carbon to the atmosphere, carbon has a tendency to hold heat and doesn't allow that radiation from the sun to re-radiate back to space. So the more carbon we put out into the atmosphere, the warmer the planet tends to get, just because we have this thicker layer of carbon dioxide, and the re-radiation of that heat does not occur. And that's what we call global warming and the accumulation of greenhouse gases. It warms up the atmosphere around Earth because it holds the heat more extensively. Pictured here is some of that is a soybean plant and the roots, and we can see these nodules here. And this is where that Rhizobium bacteria is going to reside, that's feeding on the roots of the plant and providing nitrogen for the plant and the surrounding soil. So this is where that fixation would occur. So our last cycle here, just kind of finishing this up, tidying it up. Cycle number 4 is going to be the phosphate cycle or phosphorus cycle. So the phosphorus. So the phosphorus cycle. So again, why do we need phosphorus? Well, we have phospholipids in all of our cell membranes. Nucleotides have phosphate groups. And this thing we call ATP has many phosphates, 3, and all signals, and a lot of signaling molecules uses phosphate as an activation switch or a deactivation switch. So phosphorus is cycled within the cell quite effectively. So we don't really need external sources of phosphorus. but we'll kind of look at how it cycles within an environment anyways. So here's a picture of the phosphate cycle. So a lot of phosphate put into the cycle comes from the weathering of phosphate rocks, which puts phosphates in the soil, which then can leach off, and plants can make use of. So that's how phosphorus cycles throughout. So those are the biogeochemical cycles. That is ecosystem structure. I hope that's helpful. I'll see you next time.